Dark Souls was one of the first truly immersive games I had played. Trying to find some way of expressing how I feel about it is often quite futile because I feel like I could talk about it forever. There's so much detail to the game that it's just never ending. What I can say about it though is it remains, even today, as one of the most engrossing games I've ever experienced. Every time I play another title that tries to mimic the gameplay it offers, I can't help compare the two. Nor can I let go the lessons Dark Souls taught me, which ultimately was my biggest roadblock going into the new world of Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. I've become drawn to Souls because there's no other game that can match the way it makes me feel. The obscurity of it, the lonely, enchanting music, the endless quest into the dark deep. I feel the brooding atmosphere weighing me down all the time when I play Dark Souls, from the lack of player direction to its intensely strange narrative to the meaning of Dark Souls altogether. It's odd. Its nebulous and unique offerings stand out in a market where things otherwise are built to make a lot more sense. I tire of games that hold my hand, or ones that persist so much to point out the obvious, as if I couldn't figure it out for myself or that the game wouldn't benefit for a little ambiguity. So very often, the hand of accessibility has too strong of a grip on gaming. Sekiro, on the other hand, I find to be a much easier game to understand and find my way around. I guess that's the way it was designed, yet it's still fairly veiled in unknowns, and just as difficult. It's a game that can often stir up my blood pressure quite a bit, but ironically though, it can also be quite cathartic. Sometimes I play a Souls game just for the challenge. I like the methodicalness of Dark Souls. It's slower, I don't have to count my achievements or check off an arbitrary list in a quest log. That shit can get overbearing. While it's not the same, playing through Sekiro reminds me of how inspiring the Soulsborne lineage is, and the setting alone brings about an incredibly different flavor to any other game in From Software's catalog. When you stop and look around, the most standout element about comparing Sekiro to a Souls game is that their worlds put out such different feelings, and that Soulsborne games have much more environmental diversity to them, while Sekiro remains tempered in consistency. In the Soulsborne game, the bosses you fight and the items you pick up seem to get just weirder as you progress, and they're usually quite unique from one another, and really strange. Bloodborne is full of strange secrets and labyrinths that only get more extraordinary as you undertake its adventure. From the old castles to the workshops and then suddenly into a creepy moonlit forest path full of disgusting insect creatures and beyond into dreams and nightmares. You slay witches and beasts and shadows, you duel a crazed wet nurse while Murgo's lullaby plays in the background. You fight Rom, the eerie spider, and her pack of strangely docile minions after jumping off a bridge into the reflection of a moon. And don't forget about the zombie aliens too during the celestial emissary encounter. It's all weird, but it's really cool. Everything is so strange and wonderful in Soulsborne games, and it only gets more interesting and ghoulish or eerie as you keep going. In Demon Souls, you fight a fat tubby demon halfway through the game that uses a tongue as his weapon, all the while bizarre circus-like music toys in the background. It reminds me of the kooky feeling I got when I fought Pinwheel in the next game. The Storm King and the Flame Lurker are also incredibly unique fights. The Shrine of Storms is so vividly imaginatory in its own right. In Dark Souls, you have a worm suck you into his mouth and transport you to a different area. You fight apparitions when you get to New Londo and gross piles of goo and fauna-like creatures with giant, creepy eyeballs. Later on, you'll fight the Four Kings in the Abyss after falling into the void of nothing where all is black and silent. You walk down an impossibly large tree and adventure through cities that seem to be built in the clouds. And in Dark Souls 2, it's the repulsive imagery of the Demon of Song as its standout moment for me. What strange and twisted fiction there is in the Soulsborne games. To list them all out would take far too long, but needless to say, the disturbing imagery that only gets more weird and dark and strange as you play is one of the qualities I love about these titles. Sekiro, on the other hand, seems to have a much more consistent temperament to its world. Most areas in the game are fairly realized in this undercurrent of Japanese culture and include various castles, snowy mountains, and other buildings and terrains that you would expect if you were to take a much more realistic approach to fiction. The setting alone speaks to a more grounded game, unlike Dark Souls or the twisted fiction of a game like Bloodborne. The difference is that Souls are much more based on lore, while Sekiro is much more focused on story. Dark Souls is built upon this plague that condemns all life to eternal undead. The player is prophesized to make his or her way to the final bonfire to light or extinguish the flame. What I enjoyed about Dark Souls was the pure fantasy of it. It takes its fiction to a much further place than Sekiro ever does. It's, you could say, a little bit more of a made-up game. While many bosses in both games are gigantic fictional beasts and demons, more in Sekiro feel like they could be from our world. Most of the bosses in Souls games slash away conceptions of what figures actually could be, or outright transform some of them into something else entirely. Sif might be a wolf, but he's impossibly large, for example. Skeleton dogs haunt the black depths of the catacombs. The Tower Knight from Demon Souls is larger than a building, and the Orphan of Kos from Bloodborne is something straight out of a fictional horror film. The fact that he uses a placenta as a weapon is disturbing in its own right. There's demons coated in fire, giant spiders that shoot laser beams, dragons in all shapes and sizes, a half spider, half woman, and things so creepy that they give nightmares to small children when the lights go off, like Ludwig from Bloodborne and Nito from Dark Souls. Ironically, these are just but a tiny fragment of the twisted and often freakish offered in Soulsborne titles. There are many more horrors waiting around every which corner. Even the quintessential enemy of any Souls game is the Undead Skeleton, nothing more than a pile of rotting bones that rises up magically from the ground on its own accord. Contrast any of this against the selection of bosses in Sekiro and it becomes incredibly noticeable how fantasized the world of Souls really is. Bosses in Sekiro gravitate towards a much more humanoid design, and most of them being bipedal and very human-like in appearance as well, such as samurais, generals, and warriors. While Sekiro does have a handful of strange bosses such as the Chained Ogre and the Headless or a giant snake, the roster isn't nearly as deep, nor is it as video gamey. Take for instance the Blazing Bull, which at first glance appears to be somewhat fictionalized as a giant cow with a hellacious set of fiery horns from hell. That's until you realize that they're not fully engulfed on fire, nor are they horns anyway. If you look closely, the blaze is coming from nothing more than a log that has been tied to its head. The reeds at the end set ablaze as sort of a weapon. This design speaks to a much more believable circumstance, which you really can't say for any Souls game at all during really any moment of gameplay. If not for the impossible outcry of a sky full of dragons, a forest of invisible enemies, or a wormhole that you can fall through, or a painting that sucks you into it, then it must be this invisible bridge that you have to cross on a leap of faith, or this one that you have to traverse to get to an area full of magical crystals and an albino dragon? It's all very cool stuff, but it is an incredibly fictionalized experience. Sekiro, on the other hand, has its moments of outerworldly, but they pale in comparison to the extremes presented in Dark Souls and some of its games, thus creates a much more grounded gameplay experience. To be totally honest, I do prefer the radicalness of the Souls games. It's just something that speaks to me, as there are no constraints that must be upheld. It allows for some truly creepy things to be developed when anything is up for creation. For imaginations to craft wonderfully eye-catching moments or strange visions, the freedom to build places like Blighttown, and the unsettling moments like the first time you lay eyes on this squid-like beast. The main difference most players will find between this new title and a Soulsborne game is that it can be incredibly idealistically similar, but so fundamentally different. For a long time, I wondered why I was having such a hard time progressing through Sekiro. I thought I had the formula down. Aggro an enemy, go on the defensive, wait for an opening, and wear my opponent down. That way, I would mitigate the damage I'd receive, an important element of a game that only allows you so many healing items. This is how I played all the Soulsborne games, and was a lesson I learned through many deaths. This was when I realized my mistake though. Sekiro rewards players instead who are savagely aggressive. The best Sekiro players will often be those that are uncompromising and approach defense only as a necessity that they have to deal with before going back on the offensive. Due to the new posture meter, it's much more important for players to push enemies back and beat them into submission rather than waiting for static openings. By constantly attacking, enemies will eventually stagger, which leads to a free, huge chunk of damage. Players need to worry less about where the opening is because they can create it for themselves. The biggest defensive worry along the way is simply being able to time deflections appropriately and dodging unblockable moves. Deflections essentially take the place of blocking, and because it's reflex-based and can be punished, it often feels more free-flowing and action-based. In a Souls game, you can even slap on heavy armor and dump most of your points into stamina to mitigate even more of the damage and provide yourself an even slower pace to progression. Defense in Sekiro plays a lot different than most Souls games, which place much more of an absolute need on the exercise of blocking and rolling. Souls games encourage a very slow-paced, reactive playstyle, at least for most players, and it's generally a good idea to throw up a shield, immediately assess the environment for hazards, and let enemies make the first strike. This awards players tiny windows in which to counter safely with single attacks or small combos while enemies are recovering. And in moments when blocking isn't safe, a huge, absolutely huge reliance shifts to rolling. That's because playing offensively with a two-hander, magic, or trying to parry can be incredibly risky in a game like Dark Souls, as many bosses have the ability to clap you in a single hit, and some can't even be parried at all. So usually you fall back to the safety of a big shield and rolling. You probably slapped on some rings to improve your mobility, or lowered your equip load to make your life easier when blocking wasn't an option. Either way, much more focus is put on playing smart and defensive. Boss fights can be incredibly punishing in a game like Dark Souls and require long walks back from the closest bonfire, and enemies reset, so while playing aggressively can have huge upsides, it can also lead to heartache if it doesn't work out. This sort of feeling also extends to exploring in general too, and is the main selling point of any Soulsborne game. The iconic Souls curve is one in which the player ventures out from the safety of a kindled bonfire with only a few potions and hopefully the resolve to get to the next safe area. Trekking into new areas is often difficult and taxing on your resources after all. It's always nerve-wracking when you have souls on the line that you do not want to lose. Dying feels horrible during these long marches into the deep, like places like Blighttown, especially as a first-time player. So very often it's sensible to play extremely defensive, not only when fighting, but when moving from place to place. All of this, though, is of course not referring to Bloodborne at all. Bloodborne's aggressive style gameplay is much different. Sekiro is profoundly different in the sense that the game encourages a more breakneck pace. It's the grapple hook to get you to places faster, the shorter distances between idols, the more tightly woven world, and the very aggressive, fast-paced combat. But it's an incredibly difficult experience if you go in it with a wrong frame of mind. 20 hours in, I understood that the combat should feel brutal and that I should stop playing the way I do with Souls games. This barrier is not easy to see, given how challenging the initial few bosses are and how our memories of Dark Souls affect the way we look at this game. You can avoid huge groups of enemies if you so choose, and you should at some point. You should be brave and approach every fight on your terms, not the enemy's. When I did this, I began speaking Sekiro's language, and the game began to open up for me. I flew by boss after boss, striking my katana furiously, and only stopping to dodge and riposte when it was absolutely necessary. I let loose of my fear of playing fast and loose. I realized the game wasn't as punishing as Dark Souls, even though it is every bit as challenging. After all, some walks back to the boss only were 30 seconds. Sekiro wants you to be in control of the game, and encourages you to do that. Soulsborne games want to make you feel like the game is controlling you. That's the best way I can describe it. What will not go unnoticed is the difference in how players can influence the difficulty of this game. In Sekiro, there are no friendly player notes, no co-op, or magic spells. In many Souls games, you can summon allies if you need help, NPCs too if you meet the requirements. Having an ally throughout the game can completely change the way you experience these games. Teammates make multi-enemy boss fights tremendously easier, and in some cases, teams can infinitely stunlock many enemies due to having double the attacks essentially, making progression a little bit more manageable. Sekiro's only helping hand is a resurrect, although that has extreme narrative consequences, so you won't always use it. Sekiro is essentially one large, immediate skill check, and that may be to its benefit or detriment depending on what player is playing the game. Sekiro does have consumables and other items for the player to use, but many are very situational, and some of them don't work 100% of the time, even when you think they should. For example, the random chance of firecrackers stunning the blazing bull, it's completely up in the air. This leads to an experience more dramatically driven solely by the dexterity and the focus of the player and nothing else. On one hand, having an assist mode that one could toggle off and on could safely address these concerns and give casual fans a way to experience the game too. Given the fact that there are more systems in Souls games that allow players to subvert difficulty, it's important to at least ask the question as to whether a system like this is warranted. The only way I'd recommend this is if players were warned, should they switch it on, that an assist mode would jeopardize the way that the game is meant to be played. While this would be great for mass appeal, there's something to say about forcing players to learn how to conquer the game instead of helping them complete it. But then again, you could say that opting in for a lower difficulty mode doesn't really hurt anyone who doesn't anyway. So I don't know how I feel about it. I just know that Sekiro is insanely hard, and due to its lack of accessibility options for casual players, very few of them will see it to the end. You could say that Dark Souls is much more of an RPG and Sekiro heavily action-based. Sekiro doesn't allow character creation, nor can you level up in the way you can in an RPG. Rather than spending points on stat upgrades like strength or stamina, you can acquire skills via a tree, something many action games include as their quote-unquote role-playing mechanic. This offsets the traditional RPG mechanic of grinding for power and higher stats if a player wants to, in a sense artificially lowering the difficulty progression. Grinding in Dark Souls was a big element to offsetting some of the challenge and allowed players to beef themselves up with their health pools and increase their stamina, strength, or other stats to become more powerful. In a sense, it's making the game a little bit more easy by spending the time to make it easier. If you picked up a heavy piece of armor and wanted to have the fastest movements and rolls, you could grind that out too. Power progression in Sekiro works a little bit differently and is enhanced by how many prosthetics you have or how many power-ups you have as well in your inventory, in addition to the aforementioned skill trees. You can certainly grind out some skills and combat options to make fights a little bit easier, but you really can't enhance your total power level via traditional role-playing systems like you can in other Soulsborne games. It can come across as less of an individualized game, as opposed to the strong sensation in a Soulsborne game where players choose stat upgrades that gel with the class you're trying to roleplay. Just look at the character stat sheet from a Souls game, it screams RPG. You can be a cleric, a soldier, a pyromancer, a thief, or any hybrid class that you feel like. You can min-max what you want from the very start. Find the weapons and armor you want to bring the class fantasy to life immediately. You'll travel the world seeking Titanite to upgrade them and find the items you'll need to survive to the end. You feel like an adventurer, lowly at first, powerful at the end, and unique. This aspect of actual role-playing is something truly special about the Souls franchise, and I'd be willing to bet most of you Souls fans out there watching this video have multiple save files with various characters you've built, especially the early Souls games, which have a stronger air of permanency to them. Sekiro is far more of an action game where you feel like a pure ninja badass as you sneak around its world, assassinating the ones you can while cutting down the rest without remorse. You always feel like a shinobi, no matter what skills you choose. There's only 2 weapons, you can't upgrade your armor, there's no traditional inventory system, and as far as I'm aware, there's no option to customize your appearance of your character through cosmetics. Souls games would rather have you feel like a lonely wanderer, making small decisions and choices along the way, tippy-toeing your way around the world, praying not to die, instead of dissecting it like a surgeon. Truly though, Sekiro and Soulsborne games are miles apart in presentation, combat, exploration, and just general flavor, but they're both fantastic games. Just make sure to forget everything you know about Dark Souls in order to understand Sekiro before you start.